The summer heat of 1881 hung over Fort Sumner like a burial shroud, thick and oppressive even in the dead of night. Sheriff Pat Garrett wiped the sweat from his brow as he crouched behind the adobe wall of Pete Maxwell's house, his Colt .45 heavy in his hand. Beside him, deputies John Poe and Thomas McKinney shifted nervously, their eyes scanning the darkened streets of the small New Mexico settlement. "You sure he's here, Pat?" McKinney whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant sound of crickets and the occasional lowing of cattle. Garrett nodded grimly. "Saval Gutierrez saw him not 3 hours ago. Said he was asking about fresh beef for his supper." The sheriff's weathered face was etched with determination and something else, perhaps regret. "Billy's been hiding out here for weeks, thinking he's safe among friends. The man they hunted was no ordinary outlaw. Henry McCarty, known to most as Billy the Kid, had become a legend at 21 years old. Some said he'd killed 21 men, one for each year of his life. Others claimed the number was higher. What everyone agreed on was that Billy Bonney, as he sometimes called himself, was the most wanted man in the New Mexico territory. There, Poe pointed toward a figure moving through the shadows near the Maxwell house. "Someone's coming." The three lawmen pressed themselves against the wall, hearts pounding as footsteps approached. In the pale moonlight, they could make out a slight figure wearing a wide-brimmed hat and carrying what appeared to be a butcher knife. The figure moved with the easy confidence of someone who believed himself safe, unaware that death waited in the darkness. Garrett had been tracking Billy for months, ever since the kid's dramatic escape from the Lincoln County Jail where he'd been awaiting execution. Billy had killed 2 deputies during his breakout, James Bell and Bob Ollinger, adding to his already fearsome reputation. The territorial governor had placed a $500 bounty on his head, dead or alive. The figure paused at the front door of the Maxwell house, then seemed to change his mind. Instead, he walked around to the side of the building where Pete Maxwell's bedroom window faced the street. The man appeared to be listening, as if trying to determine whether anyone was awake inside. "That's him," Garrett breathed, recognizing the distinctive silhouette. "That's Billy." What happened next would be debated for decades to come, becoming the stuff of legend and controversy. The three lawmen watched as Billy the Kid approached Pete Maxwell's bedroom window, apparently seeking his old friend's help in acquiring some fresh meat for a late supper. Billy knocked softly on the window frame. "Pete? Pete, you awake?" From inside the house came a muffled response. Pete Maxwell, a wealthy rancher and longtime friend of Billy's, had been awakened by the gentle tapping. "Who's there?" "It's me, Pete." "Billy. I need to talk to you about getting some beef." Maxwell's voice carried a strange tension as he replied, "Come around to the front door, Billy. I'll let you in." But Billy, ever cautious, seemed to sense something amiss. Instead of going to the front door, he moved along the side of the house, staying in the shadows. His hand rested on the grip of his Colt .41 caliber revolver, a weapon that had served him well in countless gunfights. Garrett made a quick decision. "Poe, McKinney, circle around back. Don't let him escape if he runs." The 2 deputies melted into the darkness, leaving Garrett alone to face the most dangerous gunfighter in the territory. The sheriff knew Billy's reputation: lightning fast on the draw, deadly accurate, and utterly ruthless when cornered. But Garrett also knew that legends could die just like ordinary men. Billy had stopped near the front porch, his head tilted as if listening for sounds from within the house. In the moonlight, his face was pale and angular, with the piercing blue eyes that had charmed senoritas and terrified lawmen across the Southwest. At 21, he looked even younger, almost boyish despite the guns at his hip and the blood on his hands. "Pete?" Billy called out again, his voice carrying a note of suspicion. "Something doesn't feel right." From inside the house, Maxwell's voice was strained. "Just come in, Billy." Through the front door. But Billy the Kid hadn't survived this long by ignoring his instincts. Something was wrong and he knew it. His hand moved to his gun as he began to back away from the house, his eyes scanning the shadows for signs of danger. That's when Garrett made his move. The sheriff stepped out from behind the adobe wall, his Colt raised and ready. "Billy Bonney," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of the law. "You're under arrest." Billy spun around, his hand flying to his weapon with the speed that had made him famous. But in the darkness, he couldn't clearly see who had called his name. "Who's there?" he demanded, his gun half drawn. "Pat Garrett, sheriff of Lincoln County." "Drop your weapon and surrender." For a moment, the 2 men faced each other in the moonlight, the lawman and the outlaw, the hunter and the hunted. Billy's gun was almost clear of its holster when he hesitated, perhaps recognizing Garrett's voice, perhaps realizing that his luck had finally run out. Pat. Billy's voice carried a note of disbelief. Pat Garrett? What are you doing here? My job, Billy. Now drop the gun. But Billy the Kid had never surrendered to anyone, and he wasn't about to start now. His Colt cleared leather with practiced ease, the barrel swinging toward Garrett's position. The sheriff didn't hesitate. His fingers squeezed the trigger, and the night exploded with the thunder of gunfire. The bullet caught Billy in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. His own shot went wild, the bullet embedding itself harmlessly in the adobe wall of Maxwell's house. As the echoes of the gunshot faded into the night, an eerie silence settled over Fort Sumner. Pat Garrett approached the fallen figure cautiously, his gun still drawn, ready for any sign of movement. Billy the Kid lay motionless in the dust, his eyes staring sightlessly at the star-filled sky above. The most feared gunfighter in the New Mexico Territory was dead at 21, his legend ended by a single bullet in the darkness. But as Garrett knelt beside the body, he noticed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Billy's lips were moving, forming words that no one could hear, a whisper that seemed to carry on the night wind long after his breath had stopped. What Billy the Kid whispered in his final moments would become one of the greatest mysteries of the American West, a secret that died with him in the dust of Fort Sumner on that hot July night in 1881. Pete Maxwell emerged from his house like a man walking to his own execution, his face pale in the moonlight and his hands trembling as he approached the body. The wealthy rancher had known this moment would come eventually, had dreaded it since the day he agreed to help Pat Garrett track down his old friend. Is he? Maxwell's voice cracked as he stared down at Billy's still form. Dead, Garrett confirmed, holstering his weapon. The sheriff's face was grim, showing none of the satisfaction one might expect from a man who had just claimed the most valuable bounty in the territory. It's over, Pete. But Maxwell shook his head, his eyes wide with something approaching terror. No, Pat. You don't understand. It's not over. It's just beginning. Deputies Poe and McKinney came running from behind the house, their guns drawn and ready for action. They stopped short when they saw Billy's body sprawled in the dust, the legendary outlaw finally brought low. Jesus, McKinney breathed. You actually did it? You killed Billy the Kid. We all did, Garrett said quietly. This was a team effort. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang hollow. He had pulled the trigger. He had ended the life of a man who, despite his crimes, had once been something approaching a friend. Poe knelt beside the body, checking for signs of life. He's gone all right. Clean shot through the heart. The deputy looked up at Garrett with something like awe. Pat, you just made yourself famous. Every newspaper from here to New York is going to want to hear this story. But Pete Maxwell grabbed Garrett's arm with surprising strength, his fingers digging into the sheriff's sleeve. Pat, we need to talk. Alone. Before word of this gets out. Garrett studied his old friend's face, noting the fear that seemed to radiate from every pore. What's wrong, Pete? Billy's dead. The territory is safe. You should be celebrating. Celebrating? Maxwell's laugh was bitter and hollow. Pat, you have no idea what you've done. What we've all done. The rancher led Garrett away from the deputies, who were already discussing how to transport the body back to town. When they were out of earshot, Maxwell turned to face the sheriff, his expression haunted. Billy knew, Pat. He knew about the gold. Garrett felt his blood turn to ice. What gold? Don't play dumb with me. The Mesilla Valley gold that disappeared during the Lincoln County War. The shipment that everyone assumed was lost to Apache raiders. Maxwell's voice dropped to a whisper. Billy figured out what really happened to it. The sheriff's mind raced back to the chaotic days of the Lincoln County War, when competing factions had torn the territory apart in their struggle for power and profit. Fortunes had been made and lost, men had died for causes they barely understood, and in the midst of it all, a shipment of gold worth $50,000 had simply vanished. That was 3 years ago, Pete. What does it matter now? It matters because Billy wasn't just hiding out here for his health. He was investigating, asking questions, following trails that should have stayed cold. Maxwell's hands shook as he pulled out a tobacco pouch and began rolling a cigarette with nervous fingers. He came to me 2 weeks ago with names, Pat. Names of men who are supposed to be pillars of the community. Garrett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. What kind of names? Territorial officials. Judges. Businessmen. Men with enough power to make problems disappear, and people too, if necessary. Maxwell struck a match, the flame illuminating his terrified features. Billy had evidence, Pat. Documents. Witness statements. He was building a case. Against who? Maxwell took a long drag of his cigarette, the ember glowing like a tiny star in the darkness. Judge Warren Bristol. Territorial Secretary William Reinerson. Half the Santa Fe ring. He paused, meeting Garrett's eyes. And me. The admission hung between them like a loaded gun. Garrett stared at his old friend, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Pete Maxwell, respected rancher, pillar of the community, trusted friend, was a thief and a conspirator. You were part of it, Garrett said, his voice flat with disbelief. The gold theft. I needed the money, Pat. The ranch was failing and I had debts. Maxwell's voice trailed off as he realized how pathetic his excuses sounded. It was supposed to be simple. Take the gold, blame the Apaches, split the proceeds. No one was supposed to get hurt. But people did get hurt. Good people died in that war. I know. Maxwell's voice cracked with anguish. Don't you think I know that? Don't you think it's eaten at me every day for 3 years? Garrett turned to look back at Billy's body, understanding beginning to dawn. That's why you helped me track him down. Not for justice. To protect yourself. To protect all of us, Maxwell corrected. Billy was getting close, Pat. Too close. He had names, dates, locations. If he'd lived another week, he would have had enough evidence to bring down half the territorial government. The sheriff felt sick to his stomach. He had thought he was serving justice, bringing a dangerous outlaw to account for his crimes. Instead, he had been used as an instrument of murder, silencing a man who might have exposed corruption that reached to the highest levels of power. Where is it now? Garrett asked quietly. Billy's evidence. Maxwell's smile was grim. That's the question, isn't it? He never told me where he was keeping it. Said it was insurance in case something happened to him. As if summoned by their conversation, a new voice cut through the night air, young, female, and filled with barely controlled grief. Tio Pete? What's happening? I heard gunshots. Both men turned to see a young Mexican woman approaching from the direction of the workers' quarters. She was perhaps 18, with long dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths of sorrow beyond her years. Celsa, Maxwell said, his voice heavy with dread. Go back to your room. This doesn't concern you. But the girl had already seen Billy's body. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Billy, she whispered, and Garrett realized with growing horror that this was no casual acquaintance. The way she looked at the dead outlaw, the raw pain in her voice, this was a woman in love. And if Billy the Kid had shared his secrets with anyone, it would have been with the woman who held his heart. Celsa Gutierrez knelt beside Billy's body with the grace of a woman who had known too much loss in her young life. Her fingers traced the outline of his face, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. He told me this would happen, she whispered, her dark eyes never leaving Billy's still features. He said the whisper would kill him before any bullet could. Garrett exchanged a sharp glance with Maxwell. What whisper? Celsa looked up at them, her face streaked with tears but her voice steady. The whisper that follows stolen gold, Sheriff Garrett. The whisper that turns friends into enemies and makes honest men into killers. Celsa, don't, Maxwell began, but the young woman cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. Don't what, Tio Pete? Don't tell the truth? Don't honor the memory of the only man who ever tried to make things right. She stood slowly, her slight frame somehow commanding in the moonlight. Billy knew you betrayed him. He knew you led Sheriff Garrett here tonight. Maxwell's face crumbled. I had no choice. They would have killed us all if Billy had talked. So instead you killed him first. Celsa's voice was soft, but it carried the finality of a judge's gavel. You think this ends it, but you're wrong. Billy made sure the truth would survive him. Garrett felt his world tilting on its axis. What do you mean? Celsa reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and use. Billy gave this to me 3 days ago. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to someone who still believed in justice. She held the journal out to Garrett, who took it with trembling hands. Even in the dim moonlight, he could see that it was filled with Billy's careful handwriting, names, dates, locations, and detailed accounts of the gold theft conspiracy. Everything is in there, Celsa said. How Judge Bristol arranged for the gold shipment to be diverted. How Secretary Reinerson provided the inside information. How Pete and the others ambushed the real guards and made it look like an Apache raid. Maxwell lunged for the journal, but Garrett stepped back, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. Stay back, Pete. You don't understand, Pat. If that information gets out, it won't just destroy me. It'll bring down the entire territorial government. There'll be chaos, maybe even federal intervention. Maybe that's what this territory needs, Garrett said quietly, thumbing through the pages of Billy's meticulous investigation. Maybe we need to clean house no matter how painful it is. Billy thought so too, Celsa said. He said the whisper of corruption had poisoned everything it touched. That's why he was gathering evidence, not for revenge but for redemption. Garrett looked down at the dead outlaw with new understanding. Billy the Kid, the cold-blooded killer, the scourge of the territory, had been trying to expose the very corruption that had helped create him. The irony was almost too bitter to bear. There's more, Celsa continued. Billy wasn't working alone. He had help from someone in Santa Fe, someone with access to territorial records. Who? Garrett demanded. Governor Wallace's secretary, a man named Thomas Morrison. Billy was supposed to meet with him next week to turn over the evidence. Celsa's voice grew urgent. Sheriff Garrett, if you don't act quickly, Morrison will disappear just like Billy did. The whisper will silence him too. Maxwell was backing away now, his face pale with terror. Pat, you can't seriously be considering this. These people have power beyond anything you can imagine. They'll destroy you. Maybe, Garrett admitted. But Billy was right about one thing. Some whispers need to be shouted from the rooftops. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Deputies Poe and McKinney had ridden back to town to fetch a wagon for Billy's body, and now they were returning with half the population of Fort Sumner in tow. Word of Billy the Kid's death was already spreading like wildfire. What do we do now? Celsa asked. Garrett made his decision. We finish what Billy started. But first we need to get you somewhere safe. If Maxwell's right about the reach of this conspiracy, you're in danger just for knowing about it. I'm not running, Celsa said firmly. Billy died for this truth. I won't dishonor his memory by hiding from it. As the crowd approached, Garrett quickly tucked Billy's journal inside his coat. To the world, Billy the Kid had died as he had lived, a notorious outlaw brought to justice by the law. But Garrett knew the real truth now, and he carried the weight of that knowledge like a stone in his chest. The crowd gathered around Billy's body, some celebrating, others mourning, all of them unaware that they were witnessing the end of one legend and the beginning of another. For in death, Billy the Kid had accomplished what he never could in life. He had found a way to make his voice heard above the whisper of corruption. Over the following weeks, as Garrett carefully built his case using Billy's evidence, the whisper that had killed a legend began to work in reverse. One by one, the conspirators fell. Judge Bristol fled to Mexico, Secretary Reinerson was found dead in his office with a gun in his hand, and Pete Maxwell simply disappeared one night, leaving behind only a note confessing his crimes. The stolen gold was never recovered, but the truth was finally told. And in the end, perhaps that was Billy's greatest victory, not the 21 men he had killed, but the one whisper he had silenced forever. Years later, when Pat Garrett wrote his memoirs, he would claim that Billy the Kid's last words were, "Who is it?" But Celsa Gutierrez knew better. She had heard Billy's final whisper that night, carried on the desert wind like a prayer. The truth will survive me. And it did. The old woman sat in her rocking chair on the covered porch, her weathered hands working steadily at the embroidery that had become her trademark throughout the Mesilla Valley. Celsa Gutierrez Morrison, she had taken her husband's name after marrying Thomas Morrison in 1883, was now 43 years old, her once raven hair streaked with silver, but her dark eyes still held the fire that had captivated Billy the Kid all those years ago. A young reporter from the Santa Fe New Mexican sat across from her, his notebook balanced on his knee and his pencil poised to capture every word. James Patterson was one of a new breed of journalists who had come west to document the passing of the frontier era, and the story of Billy the Kid's death had brought him to Celsa's door. "Mrs. Morrison," Patterson said, adjusting his spectacles, "there are those who claim that Sheriff Garrett didn't actually kill Billy the Kid that night in Fort Sumner. Some say Billy escaped and lived for many years under an assumed name. What's your response to these rumors?" Celsa's needle paused in its work, and a sad smile crossed her lips. "Mr. Patterson, I was there that night. I held Billy's hand as he died. I heard his last breath leave his body. Whatever stories people choose to tell themselves, the truth is that Henry McCarty, Billy the Kid, died on July 14, 1881. But surely you understand why such legends persist? Billy the Kid has become larger than life, a symbol of the untamed West." "Yes," Celsa nodded slowly, "I understand. People need their legends, especially when the truth is too complicated for comfort." She set down her embroidery and gazed out at the desert landscape that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "But Billy was more than a legend, Mr. Patterson. He was a man, Flawed, dangerous, but ultimately trying to do what he thought was right. Patterson scribbled furiously, sensing that he was about to hear something that had never been recorded before. Can you tell me about the evidence he gathered? The corruption he was investigating? Celsa was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the pattern of her needlework. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of carefully guarded secrets. The journal Billy kept was just the beginning. After his death, my husband Thomas and Sheriff Garrett worked together to expose the entire conspiracy. It took 3 years, but they brought down the Santa Fe ring and recovered most of the stolen gold. What happened to the money? It was returned to the territorial treasury, though by then New Mexico was well on its way to statehood. The scandal helped convince Washington that we needed federal oversight to clean up our government. Celsa picked up her embroidery again, her movements precise and practiced. In a way, Billy's death accomplished more than his life ever could have. Patterson leaned forward eagerly. What about Pete Maxwell? He disappeared after Billy's death and was never seen again. Pete couldn't live with what he'd done, Celsa said simply. The guilt ate at him like a cancer. Thomas received a letter from him in 1884, postmarked from San Francisco. Pete said he was dying and wanted to make a final confession. He'd given away everything he owned and spent his last years working in a mission, trying to atone for his sins. And Sheriff Garrett? What became of him? Celsa's expression darkened. Pat never recovered from that night. Oh, he was hailed as a hero for killing Billy the Kid, and the territorial governor gave him a medal. But Pat knew the truth, that he'd been used as an instrument of murder to silence a man who was trying to expose corruption. It haunted him until the day he died. The reporter looked up from his notes. Garrett was murdered last year, wasn't he? Shot by a man named Wayne Brazel over a land dispute. That's the official story, Celsa said carefully. But there are those who believe Pat's death was connected to the secrets he carried. The whisper of corruption never truly dies, Mr. Patterson. It just finds new voices. Patterson sensed there was more to the story, but something in Celsa's tone warned him not to press further. Instead he asked, what do you think Billy would say if he could see how his legend has grown? There are dime novels about him, stage plays, even moving pictures being planned. Celsa laughed, a sound that carried both joy and sorrow. Billy would be amused, I think. He always had a sense of humor about his reputation. But he'd also be frustrated that people remember him only as a killer, not as someone who tried to make things right in the end. Do you think he succeeded? In making things right? Look around you, Mr. Patterson. Celsa gestured toward the bustling town of Las Cruces, where electric streetlights were beginning to replace gas lamps and automobiles shared the roads with horses. New Mexico is about to become a state. We have honest government, federal oversight, and laws that protect people instead of exploiting them. Billy's investigation helped make that possible. The reporter closed his notebook and stood to leave, but Celsa's voice stopped him. Mr. Patterson, there's something else you should know. Something I've never told anyone before. He sat back down, his eyes wide with anticipation. Billy didn't just give me that journal. He gave me something else, a letter sealed and addressed to his mother back in New York. He'd been carrying it for years, never finding the courage to send it. What did it say? I don't know. I never opened it. But after Billy died, I made sure it reached Catherine McCarty. She wrote back to thank me, and in her letter, she said something I'll never forget. My son was not the monster the newspapers made him out to be. He was a lost boy trying to find his way home. Celsa reached into a wooden box beside her chair and withdrew a faded photograph. It showed a young man with piercing blue eyes and a slight smile, dressed in the simple clothes of a working cowboy. This is how I choose to remember him, she said, handing the photograph to Patterson. Not as Billy the Kid, the notorious outlaw, but as Henry McCarty, the young man who loved me and tried to do right by the world, even when the world had given up on him. Patterson studied the photograph, seeing not the cold-blooded killer of legend but a boy who looked barely old enough to shave. May I use this in my article? Celsa nodded. It's time people saw the real Billy. The legend has had its day, now let the truth have its turn. As the reporter prepared to leave, Celsa called out one final time. Mr. Patterson, when you write your story, remember this. Legends are born from whispers, but truth survives in the silence between the words. Billy's whisper may have died with him that night in Fort Sumner, but his truth lives on in every honest man who stands up to corruption, every lawman who chooses justice over politics, every person who refuses to let the powerful prey on the weak. The sun was setting over the New Mexico desert as James Patterson rode away from the Morrison Ranch, his saddlebags heavy with notes and his mind full of the story he would write. Behind him, Celsa Gutierrez Morrison returned to her embroidery, her needle weaving patterns that told stories of love and loss, of legends and truth, of a young outlaw who had died trying to redeem himself and a territory that had been reborn from his sacrifice. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, its voice carrying across the desert like an echo of all the whispers that had shaped the American West. And somewhere in that sound, those who listened carefully might have heard the ghost of Billy the Kid's final words, still seeking justice in the endless expanse of the frontier night. The legend would live forever, but now, finally, so would the truth.